Daniel, would you say blockchain governance is fundamentally flawed?
It's kind of like a tricky question. I see governance blockchain as a partial solution to some of the governance challenges that we have. The way it is being implemented right now in the large majority of DAOs is very fundamentally flawed, in my opinion, and even predictably so, which is unfortunate, and is something we've been trying to talk about a lot and keep on trying to talk about, is that in many ways, direct democracy and representative democracy are not great models. And we have many other options that are well known, that are tested, that are robust, that we could implement to improve outcomes, as well as many other systems and complements on top of what's being done right now that are not currently being taken into account. And I think part of the problem is that Web3 has seen itself, and we actually did some research into this trying to understand why it was the case, but Web3 has seen itself as the leading edge in many ways. And the positive of that is that there is a lot of people willing to try new ideas and new solutions, and a lot has been invented. But the downside of that is that there is a lot of learnings and knowledge from other spheres that have not made their way here. So in the same way that we're trying new things, we're also repeating mistakes. Mm-hmm. And if we could connect these bodies of knowledge, we could actually save a lot of time and avoid a lot of predictable things, which is particularly important in governance that has such a long cycle of testing. Like, you create a constitution, it might take a very long time before it goes wrong, even though it could be predictably wrong from the beginning. And that's why, for example, law has evolved so much with cases of law that over years, decades, and even centuries developed an understanding of ways in which relationships can go sour and create prevention mechanisms. So if we throw away the baby with the bathwater and start again from zero, well, it's going to take us decades and even centuries, even though in blockchain things move a lot faster than, let's say, in national politics, but it's still going to take us a very long time before we realize all of the mistakes that are inherent in some particular way of designing a system. So it's really important to learn from the past. Now, it's important to not copy the past, but learn from it. And I think that's the nuance, that in trying to not copy the past, we forgot to learn from it. We went a little bit into rebellion mode, like a teenager that separates from the parents' authority. And now it's that the ecosystem is maturing. It's time that we move out of adolescence, we move out of rebellion, and become this sort of independent adult that can look at things at face value in first principles and say, okay, I'm going to take some ideas from my parents, but I'm also going to make some of my own choices, and being able to marry both.
You said it's predictable. Also, there was a lot of exploits, right? And they were also kind of predictable. Why do we not talk more about governance if it's so important?
Well, I guess it's because the conversation can very quickly become very technical and very deep, and people can be very opinionated. So one of the issues of DAOs, and as well, this was coming from a lot of the research that my colleague Drea did on the challenges on DAO governance, and especially decision-making in DAOs, is that there is a very honest desire for governance to be more public and transparent, for decisions to be discussed in public forums and so on. But DAOs are also communities, and as communities, they rely on having some sort of positive sentiment for the community to stick together. No one wants to stay part of a community where there is aggression, negative vibes, where people are calling each other names. It just doesn't make you want to hang around, right? We are naturally, as humans, we are harmony seeking to a large degree. So the risk with these public decisions or these debates is that they can create tension in a community. So people prefer to take some of these subtle, complex conversations sometimes into private rooms. So I would argue that there is a lot of conversations around governance, but they're often done by high context, high expertise people behind closed doors. And it's hard to bring these into the mainstream, into the fully public forums, especially when you're combining these with the sort of Goblin Town culture, token go up, token go down. Well, is it bullish or is it bearish? Like, the quality of conversation in Telegram chats can be sometimes catastrophic. and like we suffer from this, for example. I'm now completing a term. I was recently elected a few months ago, elected for a temporary role as supervisory council for SingularityNet, which is an AI foundation. And the foundation put forward a proposal for a change in the governance, a token merger with 3 other big protocols. This is like a multi-billion-dollar merger. And we essentially saw some issues in the proposal that the foundation was putting forward. So as a sort of supervisory or at least accountability body that's meant to represent the interests of the community, we raised a public challenge to the proposal and suggested disagreeing. And immediately start getting about 50 people chasing me across platforms, trying to find ways to undermine my public credibility, to say, oh, but this guy did this, look at this tweet that he posted 5 years ago, like kind of crazy stuff. And is very tribalistic behavior that we sometimes encounter. So many people are not necessarily trained or have the boundaries or the calmness to be chased by 50 people trying to undermine them. Like I've been in governance for a while in DAOs and communities and so on. So I guess I developed a bit more of a thick skin. But I have had colleagues and many people who have left platforms and been like, this is too toxic, etc. And so you're dealing in a way with being partially in an influencer position in some of these cases, even if the day before you were never exposed to that, and then you share a proposal or an idea with a large group of people. If it gathers a lot of attention, you can get a lot of detractors and a lot of supporters even fighting between themselves. Like I have had to freeze the conversation in chats because there were supporters and detractors of something I had said calling each other names. And I couldn't get them to stop. So I had to essentially freeze the chat for everyone to take 24 hours before they could continue. Mm-hmm. Right. So there is like these sort of challenges that make the conversation difficult, but also because of what I was saying before, kind of like the inherent lag in governance is you make a decision, it's very complex. A lot of things come into it. Politics, economics, business, etc., and it's going to take a long time before it takes effect. If you're working in a restaurant, you serve a dish properly, you're a waiter, you do a good job or bad, within an hour, 2 hours, you get a tip or not. You get very quick feedback. In governance, you do not. And it's not very natural for us humans, especially dopamine addicted humans, always looking for quick feedback loops in social media, to be having very theoretical discussions about what might happen in 2-3 years down the line if you make the wrong governance decision.
Is that the reason why so many exploits happen? Because nobody cares about governance until it's too late?
Well, I think it's also a problem of resources and attention. Having been in the position of a founder a few times, you have so much to deal with. Like there is so many areas that you need to be on top of, and it's all kind of hitting you at the same time. So it's really an overwhelming position. And even though we have made quite a few advances in DAOs and in general in Web3 projects, developing better managerial models that are less founder-centric and make the founder less of a bottleneck, it's still, the role of leadership is still tremendously challenging. And I think that's something that many people outside of it don't often grasp, is how much you're trying to do the best you can, but you're having to make way more decisions that you have the time or the headspace to make properly. So when someone comes to you with an extremely dense document that you have to, again, think through many variables and many possible scenarios, we just don't really have the tools nor the training. And I say that even as a governance expert, like I wish there was some sort of computer simulator that could run a million different scenarios of what might happen. And there has been some advances of these with CADCA, the computer design of complex adaptive something systems. But essentially these are mathematical tools that can run many scenarios. But the technology to do this is still very early stage. Like we can do this for token transactions, which are very simple. But when it comes to non-quantitative, but rather qualitative things, it's like, is someone going to be able to find a way to misinterpret this law or to misinterpret this thing and convince the people that they are right. I mean, we enter into the realm of politics. And even though we've been doing governance for thousands of years, there is still very severe flaws in our governance structure. So it's just extremely difficult. And I think that's what we really need to do, is approach this challenge with humbleness and knowing that it's super challenging, that everyone needs help. It doesn't matter how many expertise, and the consequences are really big. But so we need to find ways that are cost effective, attention effective, to support projects to address governance without being overwhelmed. Because if you want them to become a founder who's also trying to build a business and needs to learn a million things about their business and manage teams and marketing and technology and dealing with investor relationships and all of those kind of things, if they also need to go and understand the 100 different scenarios in which a 20-page document can go wrong, like even if you spend your weekend trying to do it, at some point there are gaps, right? It's bigger than a single individual. And that's also the importance of trying to do these things more publicly and having communities review these and having more knowledge sharing across communities and collaboration to figure out these challenges, because it's very hard.
Okay, let's talk about solutions. You're the former head of governance at Aragon. Aragon was one of the first to really tackle this governance issue. What made you choose a different path now, and what do you think is missing in the Aragon solution? So
Aragon went through many different ways and different approaches to the way they were organizing internally. They had in some cases decentralized. Different aspects of the decentralization were quite challenging. There wasn't enough understanding about how to do it at the time, and Web3 was quite new. So they ended up re-centralizing after a series of conflicts. By the time I joined, they had become actually a very traditionally operating organization. They were incorporated as a foundation, but otherwise had a very top-down management structure with OKRs and very traditional tech startup processes. And I came into that role in part to help them develop the product and in part to help Aragon decentralize itself. And as we advanced, it became clear that the internal politics were taking more and more attention away from what they really wanted to do, because the team was under severe pressure by a board and a community that over time had become disenchanted with many of the historical decisions that had happened. So there was a lot of baggage and tension. And there were different people trying to address these, but it started to feel that it would be extremely complicated to do this sort of very collaborative creation of new governance systems that I believe is necessary, that it would be very hard to do proper R&D in those conditions while having to deal with the politics at the same time. And so it was also a bull market, so there were many opportunities. And at the time I thought, you know what, let me try to set up in a way that is not subordinate to Aragon, but could still collaborate with Aragon and multiple other partners. And that was the beginning of RnDAO. It was understanding that there were many organizations trying to understand these topics, trying to develop better solutions for how they operate internally, as well as potentially for their products, if they were building a governance or a collaboration related product. And I thought if we could actually bring these together, have more resources to do very good systematic research into these, and coming back to what I was saying of connecting bodies of knowledge, like engaging with political scientists and engaging with organization designers and engaging with behavioral economists and all of these kind of things that for a single organization is just prohibitively expensive and prohibitively complex to do, when all you're trying to do is build a new bounty board or a compensation system or a voting tool. Like, you're doing something very narrow. So bringing this large and diverse body of expertise is very difficult to do. Like, there is very little value that you can extract out of that, but the total value created is huge. So if you can divide that value, or rather leverage that value across many different projects together, then it makes a lot more sense. And ultimately, I was seeing a different configuration for this space that had to do more on collaborative R&D and incubating many ventures out of these learnings rather than incubating or supporting a single protocol, which is what Aragon was doing. Is they had to be very narrowly focused on the one tool they were building. I was very happy to collaborate in setting up some of the vision of the product that then evolved over the next year and a half, although it took its own direction, of course, with those that were stewarding it after I left. But ultimately, I saw a broader potential to be impacting many different projects and protocols at the same time, and facilitating more collaboration in this space.
Do you feel like Aragon is more about rule setting, but lacks the ability to enforce rules and to solve disputes?
Yeah, so at the time, Aragon Court was originally envisioned as this sort of mechanism that could interpret subjective rules, while the voting, the on-chain voting could be used for very simple programmatic rules, like make transfer, yes, token holders vote, transfer is made. Very, very basic. If you wanted to do something more complex, there was supposedly Aragon Court and the Constitution. But Aragon Court was way ahead of its time. It didn't have enough of a team working. It was partially a victim of Ethereum gas fees going up around, well, with the whole NFT thing around 2020, 2021, like the fees started going up. And ultimately, the Aragon Court wasn't conceived and designed properly to fulfill that job. So it was largely a good attempt that failed. And so what was left was simply a voting tool and a treasury. And at some point, people actually thought that that might be enough to govern organizations. And I would argue that that's quite naive when we look at simply, even in Web 2, where the amount of tooling that we have for governance is limited, and we envision that Web 3 will have a lot more tooling, a lot more augmentation of humans and processes that are AI automated, AI augmented, et cetera, et cetera. So, but when we look at the number of tools for organizations that exist in Web 2, there are thousands, millions of tools for all kinds of different jobs. And here we were in Web 3 thinking that we could build a whole organization with just voting and a treasury and not much else, maybe a forum, right? But we had 2 free tools to do every single job in our organization. And naturally that led to very dysfunctional organizations as well, because even the processes, the systems, the way we would set up teams, the way people would collaborate, all of those methodologies were not really conceived. There was this magic idea that because people have a token, they will collaborate. Like that was a big failure of the NFTs. It's sure they all own an NFT that doesn't incentivize them to keep on adding labor, to keep on working for the community, because you have a free rider problem. You get value whether you work or you don't. So the game theoretical incentives is the most efficient thing is buy an NFT in many communities and don't contribute to them because you don't need to. You can use your time to go to the beach. And then suddenly none of these communities had people working, and there was like a critical piece of the organizational stack, which was how do you capture value in some way? You ensure maybe NFT sales or something, but you have gathered some of the value that you're creating. Now you need to allocate these to sustain the activities that create that value, that keep the community alive. And that didn't exist. It wasn't really considered. It wasn't part of the stack. Even now, we're using mostly Web 2 methods that date from like the 19th century or even before. So there is a huge space for innovation on these really critical components of human organization.
You already mentioned your new project, RnDAO. Can you tell us more about it, and especially what are you doing differently compared to other projects in that area?
Yeah, so as I was saying before, I'm fairly critical of these very large DAOs that are trying to make a lot of decisions by people voting, whether it's token holders voting directly or electing representatives or delegates to vote in their behalf. Because you can only make very few decisions at a time, and you need to convince many people. So the throughput of sensing what needs to change and then executing on it is very small. So you move very, very slow, and there is a lot of energy spent convincing everyone. So when I was already in Aragon back in the day, I was putting forward this idea of sub-DAOs, or small teams that can quickly make decisions. Now, the key is, can you give these teams enough independence so they can quickly coordinate, try things, and you learn more from experimentation rather than from debate, and you minimize the number of decisions that the collective needs to agree on. So I'm calling these ideas swarms, which is having small teams that can collaborate and aggregate to bigger things. And what we're trying to create with RnDAO ultimately is to enable that. So we ourselves organize as a swarm. We build tools for swarm, for these sort of new approaches for human collaboration. And we help other people implement some of these methodologies. So in practice, what this looks like is that we have a series of programs for entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs to, with our support and with a little bit of the funding that we can give them, research different challenges of human collaboration. Then if they validate an opportunity, if they go and speak with potential users, do their market research, let's say, speak with experts, and they go, okay, here there is a good opportunity to build a commercially sustainable project, then they can move to the next phase where we can put in a little bit more capital, we work together with them and build these companies. But each of these projects, companies, ventures that are being built, they have a little bit of ownership that is taken by RnDAO, like you would do in a traditional incubator and accelerator. But also, if they succeed, they receive tokens from RnDAO that allow them to govern RnDAO itself. So it's a two-way relationship. And what that does is, because it's a two-way relationship between RnDAO and the companies, also by proxy, all the companies have a relationship with each other. Essentially, if one of the projects does very well, everyone else who's working the other projects also benefits. And this creates a lot of incentives for collaboration. Also because there is incentive alignment and a culture that supports that, and a lot of mechanisms underneath that support these, there is trust and the sort of behaviors that you can do. So you have more integrations, co-marketing, cross-selling, they make introductions to potential customers, they refer talent to one another, they build new tools together, they pass each other research insights, and that's the behavior that is really interesting. So for us, RnDAO is this sort of pioneering experiment. I mean, it's not the only one of its kind. There is examples of these emerging all over the world, outside Web3 as well, from like Chinese corporations to Japanese consortiums to different experiments in Web3, but is this sort of experiment of a network of teams that are not fully independent, not fully merged into a single corporation, but interdependent, sort of in the middle. And that allows them to move way faster because each team can make decisions, can explore, but then also leverage scale as a collective. Mm. The idea is that instead of having one core team or one department that needs to understand what's the strategy, what's the direction you need to go, and then try to translate that strategy into the actions that every single team needs to take, to have an approach where every team can be running quick experiments to learn whether the direction that they're taking makes sense or not. And then if you can enable a very large number of teams to be constantly running experiments and learning, you can emergently, more bottom up, figure out what are the valuable opportunities in the market for the organization to be sustainable, for it to grow, for it to advance its mission. Now, there is a few things you can govern in common, but the majority of things you delegate decision to small teams, to those at the forefront to explore. And the core organization is just there to enable those teams to do their job. It's not there to mandate the direction, it's not there to mandate the strategy, it's there to empower people, to empower teams, to discover by themselves what creates value for users, what creates value for employees, for themselves, for the workers, and what opportunities they can advance and tackle.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah, interesting. What do you think about Q blockchain and your partnership? Where are the synergies?
Yeah, I think so I heard about Q blockchain a while back, and I thought the concept was very interesting of having this sort of governance system that could support projects in their own governance. As I was saying earlier, it's quite challenging for a founder of a startup that's, I don't know, dealing with transportation or finance or something like that to be thinking about governance. It's not their core expertise. So having an organization and a platform that supports you with governance is valuable, in my opinion. Now, there is always small things we'll argue and we'll discuss, and we have a lot of interesting conversations about different theoretical aspects of it. But fundamentally, I'm now a lot more interested now that I'm seeing that they're starting to offer their services to those who are outside of the main platform. Because getting projects to migrate on top of the Q blockchain is possible. I think it could be interesting, but just economically speaking, there are other ecosystems that have billions of dollars and might outspend them. If nothing else, like I've seen some of the wars of projects that were telling me, oh, this other blockchain offered me $25 million in incentives if we move there. I'm like, what? 25? Like in free money for them? Like crazy amounts. Because there is really like an L2 war, like an arm race. And it's unfortunate. We're just competing for a very small number of projects when we could way more cost effectively invest these resources in incubating new projects. Like the amount of problems that we haven't tackled is gigantic. And instead of that, we're sort of fighting to split the pie. So I think Q would have had quite an uphill battle in the middle of this fight of titans as a smaller, at least a smaller treasury to try to fight this off. So taking the more collaborative approach of offering some of the, let's say, governance insurance services to projects that can be based in other blockchains is a decision that I think is great from their part and has also opened a lot more possibilities for us to potentially collaborate and partner in different events and initiatives with them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Recently, we've heard a lot about other solution approaches. You know, maybe you heard about MetaLex and EigenLayer. And what do you think about those? I mean, forking a blockchain every time there's a dispute sounds, yeah, a lot. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think there is a bit of an obsession around decision making when governance has many more components. And well, I'm not a big fan of forking because the social capital needed, the attention cost needed to make a forking decision is gigantic. So it's really a measure of last resort. Like as this ecosystem grows, it becomes virtually impossible for anyone to suggest a fork and actually to be able to convince enough people. Like it would take you a lifetime to go and speak with enough people to convince them. So you either need to be an influencer or you have no chance. So in practice, it's not a very good governance mechanism if you want to be assessing things frequently. It's more like a very heavy-handed, it's a little bit like a bazooka of decision-making. And if you're trying to do surgery, you don't want to bring a bazooka to a surgery because you're going to blow up the patient in a million pieces. So on the other side, there is a lot of things that you can do even before it gets to a decision that can create harmony. There is a sort of joke about capitalism that, yeah, you can choose, you have freedom of choice, but you get to choose in between two different toothpaste brands. That's the real choice that you have, because actually the politics, well, you choose between candidate A and candidate B, but none of them are real different, exactly. It's just the same thing. No? So this idea of how can we define the choices, like before a proposal gets to a forum or gets to a vote, there is a million decisions, comma by comma, letter by letter. Should these be included? No, yes, no, why yes, why no? And even before you start drafting the proposal, there is a whole understanding of what is important, what are the priorities, what are the problems we're trying to solve. And DAOs don't invest nowhere enough in these earlier stages. The Web3 ecosystem hasn't focused nowhere enough in these earlier stages of what we call sense making. It's just trying to understand what's going on, what should we be focused on, what sort of directionally, how should we be thinking about this? And actually it's at this step that we can easily be a lot more democratic, a lot more inclusive, a lot more participatory, with less conflict and at a lower cost.
Cool. Great. Thank you for your time. It was really interesting, some deep insights. Thank you so much.